Thank you very much. It's an honor and a delight to be here, and thank you, Catherine, and the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation for hosting me and indeed for hosting this event. A few years ago, I found myself, well, more than a few years ago now, a dozen or so years ago in San Francisco, and I got into a very delightful conversation with a fellow named Dan Pallotta. You may know Dan. He wrote a very provocative book called Uncharitable about the importance of the nonprofit sector. And Dan was weaving this really interesting story, interesting to me, perhaps, in terms of the charitable sector. And he spoke about the first European settlers to United States, the Pilgrims. And I'll pause for a moment and say, if there are any pilgrims in the audience, I mean no dishonor to your faith and your beliefs, but the Pilgrims were a particularly humorless group of people. I'm an Anglican, and my forebears in England were glad to see the backs of the Pilgrims because they had the habit of interrupting sermons in Anglican churches and questioning the authority of the vicar. So they were a rather irksome and humorless group, and they dispatched themselves to the United States and set about to create what they called the city on the hill, the shining city on the hill. And they were particularly industrious. They were good at business, and they thrived in business. And indeed, they were so successful in business that when they picked up their Bible and read in the Bible that it's easier for a camel to pass through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven, they got very worried because they thought, this is not good for us. Our souls are in jeopardy. So they decided they would be as good at charity as they were at business. And I think that sort of notion that charity is here and it's about doing nice things for people who have certain disadvantages and so on, and business is about returning value to shareholders, it's about being industrious and so on. That sort of notion of the dual world is not something that sadly is just with the Pilgrims. It's really affected a lot of the way that the world sees itself, certainly the developed world and certainly the English world. In Canada, our charity laws are based very much on this notion that charities are not supposed to do things that look like businesses. They're not supposed to do things that generate revenues, for instance, because that's what businesses do. Charities are supposed to give things to people that don't have things, and they're supposed to be nice to poor, unfortunate people. This notion of the stark wall between business and charity has begun to break down quite substantially in the United States, thanks a lot to the work of Dan Pallotta and many others. It's also broken down in Canada and the UK and indeed here in Australia. And there's begun to be this wonderful hybrid space that's beginning to fill up between what we used to think of as charity, which is just simply putting Band-Aids on people who are bleeding, and business, which is about doing things to generate money to return value to shareholders. And this space has various names. It's often called social enterprise or social finance, social innovation. I was particularly impressed when President Barack Obama was elected, and it's a tradition in the United States that when a president is elected, his first symbolic act is to create some sort of an initiative that in some ways is to define his administration. And President Obama's initiative was to create the White House Office for Social Innovation, and it subsequently became known as the White House Office for Social Innovation and Civic Participation, and it became a real leader in the United States in terms of identifying things that work, successful social initiatives, and then figuring out how to scale and replicate those in communities across the United States. So the innovation spectrum is really beginning to fill out in many parts of the world. We're beginning to see things like social purpose businesses that are formed in order to generate revenues, but instead of the value returning to shareholders, the value is going back into the business, and often the value is going into community. It's going into the people who work in the business, and it's intended to adopt the framework and mechanism of business, but to achieve a social purpose and a social outcome. And I think, in a word, what's beginning to happen in many parts of our world is we're beginning to reconnect this idea that money and meaning should be actually joined. that money is not something over here that we worry about making lots of money so we can then use the money to do good, but we can actually, in the process of generating money, we can actually also generate meaning. Now, innovation, especially innovation in the financial sector, of course, got a bit of a dirty image in the lead up to the 2008 recession. In the United States, first under President Clinton and then under President Bush. And I should stop for a moment and say you can tell I'm Canadian because I always talk about the Americans. And one of the things that defines a Canadian is we feel vaguely morally superior to our friends in the United States. So I will continue in that. And again, I apologize to any Americans in the audience because another defining feature of Canadians is we always apologize and we're always sorry. First under President Clinton and then under President Bush, there was this notion that home ownership was a wonderful thing and everyone should become a homeowner. And in fact, wouldn't it be great if home ownership wasn't just the preserve of the wealthy and the middle income, but wouldn't it be great if home ownership could be something that lower income people, indeed even the poorest of the poor? And so they dispatched the brightest minds in Wall Street to try and come up with some way to turn every American household into a home-owning household. And someone somewhere along the way came up with something that we now call the ninja mortgage, no income, no assets. And the brilliant idea behind the mortgage was because everybody knows that there's only one way that property values go, and that's up. They always go up, inevitably. It's a law of nature. They never go down. And so therefore, you could borrow against the future value of your house, so you get a mortgage that in fact would pay for itself over time. And it was a brilliant idea, so simple and so perfect that it's kind of strange that it took so long for somebody to think about it. And these mortgages were sold out into the world. Of course, one small thing happened, which is that sadly the law of gravity applies to house prices as it does to everything else. And when U.S. house prices collapsed in 2008, it brought down not only the U.S. housing market, but it brought down the entire global economy. We ushered in the recession, the post-2008 recession, thanks to this notion that we could somehow come up with a financially innovative ownership product that would ensure that everyone becomes homeowners. So financial innovation took on a dirty frame, but I think actually we need to go back to the idea that we need to actually take the bright minds in the financial world and get them to be innovating, but not innovating on initiatives that ultimately are disconnected from value and meaning. But we need the kind of entrepreneurialism, the imagination, and even the risk-taking that financial innovation can bring. We need to build an architecture that supports innovation, that supports creativity. And I want to say to you, I think the philanthropic sector is actually the perfect sector to begin to not only lead, but also to help finance some of this innovation and creativity. Now, we know when it comes to building housing that there are a number of technical skills involved in building housing. I've developed a number of housing projects in Canada. I'm happy to say, and my wife will in fact enthusiastically say this, I couldn't do any wiring in the house. I have no idea how the plumbing works. If our tap leaks, we have to call somebody because I couldn't tell you how to fix things. I missed that part of my boyhood where playing around with tools and so on. I don't like doing that. I did create, I'm happy to say, a handrail on my front porch, and I'm quite proud of it, but it's the only product that I've actually done that's of any personal value in terms of housing. So I know nothing about the construction of housing, but I actually know people who do. And I'm able to engage them in the useful work of housing. I also know people who understand about the financing of housing, people who understand about human services, about working with people that live in the housing. And I know that in Canada, what we've started to do in terms of creating housing is to create blended investment funds, which allow us to take different types of financial products and use them to help build housing because at different stages in the housing process you need different kinds of money or different kinds of financing. So just pause for a moment. The other day I gave a long and in my mind dreadfully interesting history of housing in Canada starting back in 1867. I'll spare you the glory of that. But I will simply say to you that from 1973 to 1993, Canada had a national housing plan. It was brought in by a minority government, which of course means that the political party elected the government didn't have enough seats to actually control the majority of the House, so it relied on a third party in the House, the Social Democratic Party, and the condition of their support was that the government of the day had to bring in a national housing plan. And the government not only did bring in a national housing plan, but to its credit, when it succeeded after the next election in becoming majority, it increased its commitment to the national housing plan. The national housing plan from 73 to 93 funded about 600,000, slightly more than 600,000 homes across Canada, which is quite a lot. Canada is a country of currently about 36 million people, so slightly about a third bigger, I think, than Australia. Like you, we're a country that has a broad geography, although most Canadians do live in cities along the southern fringe of the country, and then we have our remote rural and northern areas where there are relatively few people and relatively more polar bears. When we had our national housing program, the government did a few things that were very, very helpful. In addition to providing a direct grant, which helped on the capital side. It was never 100% financing, but it also backstopped mortgages. It provided a mortgage guarantee, which meant that when I was developing housing under the glorious National Housing Program, I could go to the bank and negotiate, and the bank would give me a very good financing rate, knowing that if for some reason my project went wobbly, that the government would step in. Now, in all of those 600,000 homes and all of those projects, only 2 ever went wobbly. It's a remarkably stable and good sector. So it was a good investment on the part of the government. And any banker will tell you in Canada, a remarkably good investment for banks because it was guaranteed to make money for banks. They always got their money and they were always guaranteed they'd get their money if anything went wrong. So in 1993, our government decided that enough with the National Housing Plan. It was now time for the private housing markets to stand on their own feet. And the government said that Canadians henceforth would find the housing that they needed in either the affordable rental, the private rented sector, which represents about a little less than a third of our housing across the country, I think roughly similar to Australia, or in the private ownership market, which represents roughly 2/3 of our housing system across Canada. Now, the private sector in Canada is robust. We have long, cold winters in many parts, most parts of the country, but our housing sector just really plugs along. And most years, even post-2008, we didn't. Our housing market didn't collapse. Our private housing market didn't collapse like the American or the British or the Spanish or many other national housing markets. And we continue to generate near record levels of new housing in our cities, high-density housing in rural areas and northern communities, more medium and low-density types of housing. But like here in Australia, most of that housing is increasingly out of reach, not only of low and moderate income households, but even middle income households, key workers in our cities, police officers and nurses, people who collect our garbage, people who do the things that make our cities strong and safe and good places to live, are increasingly finding that they're frozen out not only of the ownership markets, but of the rental markets. So that's more or less the context from post-1973, where we've had a government that has withdrawn from the housing sector. We've had housing developers, affordable housing developers who grew reliant on a single system, a system that in which the government was the central player in the markets. And since then, we've been thrust into an unknown world. And all across Canada, there's all sorts of innovation that is happening in our housing world in terms of investment in a range of housing styles. If you can name a particular housing need, I can tell you a housing initiative in some part of the country that's addressing it, whether it's specialized housing needs like our national at-home chez soi project to address mental health and homelessness, dealing with 1,000 people in 5 cities across the country, people with some of the most severe challenges in terms of their ability to be able to access and maintain housing, and successfully housed in the At-Home Chez Soi project. We have housing for intravenous drug users that successfully provides stable housing for people who have that particular serious health issue. We have housing models for any number of challenges, and some of them mix things up. I was in Vancouver on our west coast visiting a housing project that mixed together men who had left prison, had been long-term in the prison system, with young single moms. And it was quite interesting when I walked in, and the main floor was a little sort of common area with some places for the tenants to gather and kind of enjoy themselves outside of their particular units. And I saw this fellow who was, to my eyes, obviously what we would call a rounder, somebody who'd spent most of his life in prison, tattoos, rough-looking kind of guy, the kind of guy you wanted to say yes please and no thank you to, because probably he would commit a bodily injury if you weren't nice to him. And he was cradling a little infant baby while the mom was looking on, the teenage mom was looking on. And the expression on his face was one of complete sweetness. And it was remarkable. The last housing project that I was directly involved in developing in 2009 mixed together, it's a 112-unit project, mixed together 56 units for people, seniors who are frail and elderly, with 56 units for people living with HIV/AIDS. A lot of interesting mixes happening there. And when we first proposed this mix, we were told that these two populations are not going to get along very well, that in fact, what we find is that people in this complex, that they go out shopping together, that sometimes if one of the people with HIV/AIDS is having a bad day, that one of the seniors will go out and get their groceries for them, or will visit them in their room and make a cup of tea, or vice versa if one of the older residents is having a bad day. So all sorts of wonderful projects that have been developed, and I want to just spend the last few minutes talking about some of the architecture, and by that I don't just mean, Rob, the physical architecture, but the financial and social architecture that's led to these wonderful projects, and then leave you with 3 challenges that we're facing squarely in Canada. First of all, of course, money is very, very important, and what we do realize is that blended investment funds are necessary in order to create housing that offers options, especially for very low-income people who require deep subsidies because of their low-income status in order to be able to afford the housing. The numbers just simply can't work in terms of the actual costs of managing the building and operating a building on the very low incomes of the poorest Canadians. So we create typically blended investment funds that are a combination of 3 principal, although many specific varieties of investments. We have foundations in Canada like the Canadian Alternative Investment Cooperative, CAIC, which provide grant making into the house building sector. So they'll provide money in which they do not expect any of it's a direct grant, there's no expectation of repayment. We also sometimes look to high net worth individuals, that is to say the phenomenally, sinfully wealthy and rich, and if there are any of you in the audience, I'm happy to speak to you afterwards and extract funding from you. We look to that sector for what we call patient capital, for money to be invested over a 10-year period with no expectation of a financial return, but some expectation that the principal will be returned in some form. And because an investment in real property does generate revenues, especially since most of our buildings are not only mixed income buildings, but they're also they have private retail and other forms of tenancies that generate revenue, that we can actually support a repayment stream. And then, of course, we look to investment grade funds, and increasingly this part of the Canadian sector is being built out with funds where there is a financial return to the investor for investing in the housing that's competitive with what they could achieve in terms of other investors. Many of these initiatives, these blended investment funds, were started by philanthropic foundations, started with a grant-making process. The seed money, the first dollar in the pot came from philanthropic foundations. A lot of the research and policy work that we do in Canada, Catherine mentioned the work that the Lord Mayor's Foundation has done in terms of helping to give a better picture of the complex set of needs in a city like Melbourne. And we think it's important to understand there's not one housing need, and so therefore it's not possible to have one housing solution that fits all the range of needs there are in a city like Melbourne, or indeed in my hometown of Toronto or other Canadian cities. So we do need to understand better the variety of needs and how we can ensure the solutions stack up. And of course, on the investment side of the philanthropic sector, mission-based investing, which I know the Lord Mayor's Foundation and others are beginning to, or perhaps well advanced in terms of mission-based investing. We, for quite some time, and me in particular with my limited imagination, when I look around and I look at all these big sovereign funds that exist in Canada, our national superannuation fund called the Canada Pension Plan, untold trillions of dollars in it, and my eyes go starry when I think of all that money and what one could do with even a small slice of that. And think of how we can begin to access those funds and create investment-grade products with real financial returns in order to draw in from that particular sector. We've started to develop intermediary organizations in Canada because it is important to have a good backbone. One of the challenges in the philanthropic sector has been that in many ways the people that donate to the philanthropic sector understand if there is a hungry person and you hand them a bag of groceries, you donate some groceries to them, then they understand that's charity, that's a good thing. They understand if you have somebody in the Salvation Army and they have an overnight bed in the Salvation Army and are protected from the elements, that's good, that's charity as well. But when we say to people in the philanthropic sector, we need to build the architecture of the sector, we need to build intermediary organizations that understand financing, that are able to create complicated, complex financial instruments, they say that doesn't look like charity to us, that looks like you're giving money to lawyers and accountants and those sorts of things, but it's absolutely necessary. So we've actually, at the national level in Canada, we have an initiative called the Mars Centre. It originally started off as a centre, and it still does much of its work in terms of the commercial application of medical research, but has been deeply involved in social financing and the creation of social finance funds. One of their initiatives at the moment is to create a social venture exchange, which is actually up and running. It looks, smells, and feels very much like the stock exchange, but instead of buying a mining stock or an oil and gas stock or a banking stock, you're buying stock in a social initiative in a city. These are, again, investment grade stocks that you're buying, and the risks are assessed and are appropriate to the particular initiative. It's a really interesting and new idea for us in Canada. It's an idea that's starting to take off in other parts of the world as well. And for us, interestingly, one of the partners in this was the Toronto Stock Exchange, one of the leading global stock exchanges, and they were very interested in the idea of how can they take the mechanism of the stock exchange and apply it to something that is in the common and social good. At the community level, we have community loan funds like the Ottawa Community Loan Fund, where a couple of years ago, more than that now, we were interested in getting some of the big pension funds, one of the big union pension funds that represents federal employees in Canada, to make some investments from their superannuation fund into affordable housing. And they were very interested, but they said that they needed to have something that was, again, investment grade. They couldn't afford to lose the money because the people who are set to retire from public service rely on the superannuation fund to provide them with a decent retirement. So we worked to set up an affordable housing fund, and again, we created a blended fund where we had some high net worth individuals who were prepared to put in some patient capital. We had some philanthropic foundations who were prepared to put the seed money in for some grant making. In our province of Quebec, the French-speaking province of Canada, although many other parts of the country also speak French, because of some unique political and social circumstances in Quebec, there's a large and significant social finance sector. It's often known en français as the économie sociale, a well-developed sector that in its early years got preference from the government in terms of financing major infrastructure works and was able to build up a very powerful and strong base. I'll mention a few other initiatives that we're experimenting with and have implemented successfully. Housing bonds. Some of our large social housing providers are big enough that they can actually go into the bond market, sell bonds, and use those bonds to repair or retrofit existing housing or build new housing. A number of years ago, we began, our national government recognized the value of green bonds, specifically geared to energy retrofit in Canada. Of course, a cold northern country, and utility costs are very high for Canadians, and we recognize that if we can bring down utility costs by retrofitting housing with better insulation and more efficient heating systems and that sort of thing, that the savings would be both immediate and long-term. So green bonds were created as a way of capturing future savings and putting those into the immediate costs of retrofitting. We've now created and are working on expanding housing bonds, much the same idea. We're looking at other forms of social bonds and similar kinds of investments. Social impact bonds. I'm sure you've, I don't know if there's actually been an experiment launched in Canada, but close to a decade ago here in Australia, I should say. In Canada, close to a decade ago, we began to look for a particular sector where we could launch social impact bonds. These are bonds where the rate of return of the bond is based on social outcomes, the social return from the initial investment. And the theory behind the social impact bond is when you identify a particular social issue and attach a bond to that issue, that there are savings attached that will be realized in the future, and those savings can be captured and used to repay the bondholder and to pay a rate of return. So we thought we'd start with homeless people living with HIV/AIDS. Now, HIV/AIDS, when we first started this, was a very deadly disease. It was at the dawn of the antiretrovirals and so on. And in particular, people who were in the cold Canadian climate and with suppressed immune systems were particularly susceptible to respiratory infections and were often in the hospital emergency wards consuming large amounts of public resources in our national healthcare system. In fact, we estimated a typical homeless person with HIV/AIDS, based on our longitudinal study of 600 people, was consuming about $300,000 a year worth of emergency room services. That wasn't including the regular care they required because of their HIV/AIDS status, but it was on top of that. So we went to the Ministry of Health and we said, we can save you $300,000 a year because we know that when people are properly housed, that they're less susceptible to respiratory infections, and they're not going to be visiting the emergency ward once a week or more often. And it'll only cost you $30,000 a year rather than $300,000 a year. So we've worked to create a social impact bond around that and around other issues as well, men leaving jail and so on. I want to mention one project, the YWCA Elms Center in downtown Toronto. It's a housing project, 310 units of housing. It's specifically geared for women. 150 of the units are affordable housing for women. That is just simply units that can be no more than 30% of the income of low-income women. So the rent is geared to income. If they're have zero income, they pay zero rent. If they have $100 income, they pay $30 in rent, and so on. There's also in this building 100 supportive units. That is, say, units for women who have mental health issues, substance use issues, other serious health concerns, and require housing plus specific services in order to maintain their homes. Also in this building, 50 units for Indigenous families, including 10, or in addition, 10 units for Aboriginal women fleeing violence. And 15% of the units overall are set aside for older women because, like in Australia and Canada, we haven't figured out yet how to deal with the problem that people are getting older. It seems to be a global phenomenon. Who knew that people got older? And it's a terrible issue. So this is a wonderful project, and when you look at it, the exterior of the project, I was at an event last night and I showed a picture of it. It's actually not a very remarkable looking building. I'm sorry to say that we didn't have Rob designing it. It would have been quite nice if we had. It's unremarkable on the outside, but what's interesting is the financing model of this particular building. When the executive director, the CEO of the YWCA, which is a 112-year-old organization, owns substantial properties around Toronto, has a long history of effective financial management. When they went to the bank to secure a $40 million loan to allow for the construction of the project, the bankers looked at them and with sort of horror and said, "You want to build housing for whom? And how are they going to pay for their housing? And why should we be putting money into that kind of a housing project?" And so basically, very quickly ushered them out the door. Refused to, it just didn't fit any of the criteria that seemed to pass the sniff test for a chartered bank. And even with government backstopping the mortgage, the banks were unwilling to touch this money. We had earlier that year set up with our provincial government, which is the equivalent of your state government, an infrastructure fund. And when I say we, I mean they set up an infrastructure fund, and then we went to them and said, "It's great that you're putting money aside for building roads and transit and all the physical things that make our cities good and great. And keep doing that. That's good for the economy. It's good for our cities. But we also need to understand that housing is an important part of the physical infrastructure of cities, and you need to have a dedicated housing fund as part of your infrastructure fund." And the government responded by creating a $500 million capital revolving fund, and they would capitalize the fund by going into the private markets, selling provincial bonds. In the post-2008 era, with the bond markets, like everything else, pretty desperate, they were able to sell the bonds for next to nothing and get lots of good take-up, and in turn put that money out into the community for interest rates of less than 1%. So the YWCA Elm Centre was able to access that financing, and they were able to build this project. And what's very, very important about this municipal or this provincial infrastructure fund is that it was also the charitable sector, which was a very powerful voice with government saying that we'll play our role, we'll put our financial resources to play, but the government also has a role to play. So I want to end just with three quick challenges that we have, not quick, big challenges that we have encountered in Canada. The thing we find with our extensive history since 1995 and pilot projects in dozens, scores of pilot projects across the country is the transaction costs for the first pilot project are always high. It's always complicated to put together the financing. It's always complicated to create the partnerships between the private sector, the private builders. It's always complicated to deal with the human services dimensions of these projects. All of that requires significant upfront investment, and the transaction costs are always very, very high. And if you're to judge the success of the program based on pilot costs, you'd say there's no way we'd ever duplicate any of those pilots because we just simply can't afford to spend 20 or 30 cents on the dollar just packaging the financing and putting the program together. But that's the nature of pilot projects, is that it's the first time you're doing something and the transaction costs are always very high. Second and third time, if you do it right, transaction costs come down. And this is also where private philanthropy can step in and say, we understand that there are some unique costs associated with pilot projects, and we're prepared to support the community sector in terms of covering some of those extraordinary transaction costs for the first investments. The second big challenge is building up the intermediary specialist organizations in the sector, the financial organizations, the development organizations that provide the specialized expertise. I get approached several times a week by churches, by mosques, by community organizations saying we have a little piece of land here, we have an idea for something there, we'd like to develop a project, and I tell them that's a wonderful idea, but you can't do it on your own. In the current climate in Canada, a typical housing project requires up to 40 different funding streams. It is a massively complicated project, and if there aren't financial intermediaries and other development specialists, then your project is not going to go very far. So building up that intermediary sector is also, I think, a very important role for the charitable sector. Now, it doesn't look like charity when you're spending your money building a community development corporation rather than spending your money handing out food to people who are hungry, but it's an equally important initiative. And finally, the third big challenge, and this is the challenge we've yet to be able to successfully overcome, which is how do we take all of the particular successes from all of these individual pilots and scale them up to meet the actual need right across the country. Canada continues to fall behind in terms of meeting the particular housing needs of Canadians. I'm ashamed to say that. I'm not proud to stand here and tell you that my country is failing in these needs, and it's not failing because we lack the resources or lack the intelligence to do it. We're failing because we lack the ability to be able to scale from pilot to national need. And that, I think, is a particular role where, again, philanthropic organizations working with governments, working with business, working with community organizations can really work together to solve that particular piece of the puzzle, which is how do we turn one-off projects into the way that we do business in terms of housing across the communities. So with that, thank you very much for listening to a few ideas. You are all going to be part of the solution here in Melbourne in terms of it. I'm looking forward to the conversation and getting into some of the specific details of some of the tools that we've used and how we might be able to share some good practices with you. Thank you.
Michael, with the blended funds, what's the typical proportions of the CARC versus the about 20, 30?
Well, it's very project specific, and I would like to be able to say one third, because that has a certain poetry to it, but it is very specific. When we do, for instance, restoration of existing buildings, we often find when we take off the first layer of the building that there are all sorts of things that we hadn't encountered, and of course new construction, there's remediation costs that sometimes are not fully understood until they go. But what I will say to you is that one of the ways that we try to be a bit more precise about, we of course develop, as one would expect, pro formas for all of our work, and constantly test the pro formas to ensure that the building is actually performing up to where we think it should be financially. We believe in a mixed income model for our housing, so we never build housing. Actually, now that I say it, the last project I built in 2009 was 100% of the units received some form of income or rent subsidy to support them, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So depending on the particular mix of incomes, you can build a cross-subsidy within the building, and that can deal with some of your operating costs, and that has implications. As any of you know who develop housing in the situation is certainly the same in Canada, that in the early years of a housing project, typically the repayment of your financing costs, if you've gotten fairly deep into the financing pool, are your biggest expenses. And in fact, when we had a national housing program, the program was designed to recognize that in the first 10 years of the agreement between the nonprofit housing provider and the government was the repayment by the nonprofit housing provider of the capital subsidy, and it would start very small and grow bigger as people step out of their mortgage, their financing obligations. So not a very satisfying answer, but I think it really does depend on if we're able to secure land or structures at a reduced cost or free, if we're able to, we've got a few land trusts. We've got 4 land trusts, community land trusts in Toronto, and we're able, in some cases, to leverage the value of the underlying land, and that, of course, helps with the financing. So, different package.
But your general philosophy is what we would call social mix in terms of your investments.
Absolutely. In the 1940s, 50s, and into the 1960s, Canada, like the United States, built a lot of public housing projects, government-owned, government-managed projects, initially full of low-income working people, but very quickly became places where primarily people who were excluded from the employment market, people living on social assistance, very poor people were living in public housing. And the perception by the end of the 1960s was this was a failed experiment, that we shouldn't be having these kinds of high-rise neighborhoods, and that a mixed-income neighborhood was better. And that's been the approach since the 1970s.
I'm Jeanette Large from Women's Property Initiatives, and we're a community housing provider. I've been involved in community housing for a very long time. The idea of housing bonds has been around for a very long time, but has never managed to get off the ground. And so I'm very interested in how your housing bonds operate in Canada. Is there government backing? What's the sort of return?
So yes, there is government backing, which means that housing bonds are remarkably safe investments. We have, in some cases, it's our municipal government. I think our municipal governments tend to be a bit larger than your local governments here. The City of Toronto, where I live, there's about 2.5 million people in the City of Toronto, and then in the greater sort of urban agglomeration, the larger area, about 9 million people. But the City of Toronto itself does backstop housing bonds and other social bonds. They backstop bonds to create community centers and that sort of thing. And that's absolutely the key to it. The other key, as I mentioned, a financial intermediary, the Mars Centre, and they have specialists who design and create investment-grade bonds so that I'm sure you're very smart and have lots of experience, but our experience in Canada is that most people who are engaged in the community housing sector don't have the same skills as the people who are engaged in financing, and so therefore we want to bring some of those skills into the community housing sector. So I think those are the two things that are quite critical. And I do want to emphasize this notion of blended investment, because I don't know of a housing initiative in Canada that can be financed entirely with housing bonds or with a social impact bond or something. It's all part of a package of tools, and there always is some form of grant that is necessary, whether it's the land or something else that's part of it. These become very complex. I'm sure your housing is complex as well, but ours, as I mentioned, has up to 40 different streams of financing, and some of that as well is just good old-fashioned fundraising, where you go out and say to people, give me some money, and I've spent my fair share of wandering the highways and byways trying to convince wealthy people to give me money. So it is, there's no magic bullet on that. What we are hoping, though, is that we've now sold enough bonds, housing bonds in various parts of the country, especially Quebec and in British Columbia, our Western Canadian province, Vancouver, that we think that there can be now a market that can be a viable and ongoing market. And just before I left, I was sitting with a securities a fellow who sells securities, licensed in the stock exchange, and he was sitting in the whiteboard at my office, and he started putting numbers up on the whiteboard, and he ended up with $10 billion, and he said, I can capitalize housing bonds for $10 billion, are you interested? And I said, I am very interested. $10 billion is a very interesting sounding number. We could do a few things with that. I have no idea how viable it is, though. I didn't understand how he got from that part of the whiteboard down to the $10 billion. So I will admit to you that I'm not a specialist. I've spent my life associating myself with specialists and letting them do the hard thinking.
My name's Amanda Millage, and I'm on the board of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. One of the challenges I thought might be, certainly relevant here is the planning challenge. There are a lot of people who don't necessarily want community housing in their backyards, and yet that's, ideally you want to put it somewhere that's desirable. So has that been a challenge, and how have you overcome that?
Well, can I start with a very naive and personal affirmation that I continue to believe, despite years of working in this sector, that people are basically decent and good, and if you give them an opportunity to act properly, that they will act honorably and decently and good. So one of the things that we've done, because we've experienced the same issue, we will get we'll labor to create a wonderful initiative in a community, and then one or two loud voices will stand up and say, no, we don't like it, there's not enough parking, or they'll come up with some crazy excuse. The project we visited the other day was on a municipal parking lot, and people were upset that there was going to be no sunlight for their cars on the parking lot. I tell you, the imagination of people is. So because I sort of facetiously, but I actually honestly believe this, and our opinion polls that are done by when we have the money to get the polling do suggest that the majority of people in fact do welcome well-designed and good projects into their neighborhood. In Canada, we have a long history of associating good housing with good health, that our earliest social housing and public housing projects in 1913 were actually started by the medical officer of health for the city, who started for public health reasons, not for economic or social reasons. And there's been that long tradition. Most Canadians, I think, do respond to that. Opinion polls show 60 to 70% of Canadians say that they want governments and communities to have more affordable housing. They recognize homelessness and the housing crisis being a serious issue. So one of the things that we try and do is we operate on several levels in terms of challenging the ability of people to object. We organized a coalition a few years ago through the Multi-Faith Alliance to End Homelessness, which is a network that I helped to create a number of years ago, which consists of Christian congregations, mosques, synagogues, temples, all sorts of different places of worship. And there's a common value structure amongst all of these faiths, that this notion that we should take care of each other, that it's reflected in love your neighbors yourself and all the different variations on the theme. And what we do when there's a project in the community is we go into the community and we go to the places of worship and we invite them to come into the conversation, to raise their voices, not to outshout the negative voices, but to say, actually, there's a majority of people who welcome this into our community. The second thing we do is we look at local zoning and planning processes, and I know they're different in Australia than they are here, but in Canada, as a matter of right, if a project, a rezoning project is happening in your neighborhood, you have the right to object, and you have the right to have a hearing. And we've intervened to try and have the rules of the hearing respect a human rights focus. So if someone stands up at a hearing and says, I don't want those people in my neighborhood because I don't want poor people or Indigenous people or this sort of thing or that sort of thing, the chair of the hearing is obliged and instructed to say that those comments serve no role in this process. It's about setbacks, building heights, it's about the physical characteristics of the building, it's not about the social characteristics of the tenants, and those comments won't be taken into account. So we try and intervene in the process in order to create a more civilized atmosphere and to shut down some of the loud voices that sometimes tend to dominate the process. And the final thing that we've done in Canada, we're not quite as litigious as the United States, but we have increasingly been using our court system as a way of dealing with discriminatory zoning and planning rules. In Canada, there used to be widespread rules around spatial segregation for things like homeless shelters or supportive housing projects for people with special needs, mental health or physical health needs and so on, that they couldn't be more than, say, 700 meters there had to be at least 700 meters between them because you don't want too many of those kind of people, quote unquote, in a particular neighborhood. And we've successfully had those overturned now by the courts, saying that's a violation of human rights, that you can't say that people who have certain physical, social, religious, other characteristics, that they can be prevented from living in neighborhoods. And so we've tried to launch a series of initiatives. There's still grumbling that happens. And I believe that in almost all the projects that we've been involved in, once the project is finished, people are actually quite happy with it and they're quite surprised. We've also commissioned a lot of research. The research institute I work for, and this might be something the Lord Mayor's Foundation might be able to find some way to look at what is the actual impact of these projects in communities. We did a study a few years ago called We Are Neighbors, which looked at supportive housing in communities, looked at property values, crime rates, and issues like that, and found not only was there no correlation, but in fact, there was surprisingly, in a number of situations, the crime rate actually decreased in neighborhoods after the social housing and the supportive housing went in. And part of our theory, we don't really know exactly why there's that correlation, but part of our theory was that in supportive housing, people tend not to work, so they sit on the front porch. In Canada, people have big front porches. So they sit in their front porch during the daytime and they keep an eye on the neighborhood, and it makes for a safer neighborhood. That's our theory. May or may not be true, but it is true that the crime rate was actually lower in those neighborhoods.